Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar on the HathiTrust Statement of Values. I am Melissa Stewart. I am here with HathiTrust Executive Director Mike Furlough and our HathiTrust board member Mimi Calter from Stanford University. And we are going to talk about the Statement of Values, but first I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to them. So, and why am I having... there we go. All right, so just like most of our webinars, we're going to ask that everybody keep your cameras and your microphones muted during the main part of the presentation, and feel free to type questions into the chat at any time. I've got Jessica Rohr, our member engagement and communications specialist here, moderating this session, and she will read your questions aloud in the chat at the appropriate time. And we are actually a small enough group to when we get to the end to the question answer, if anybody wants to unmute and ask questions aloud, that will be okay at that time. All right, and with that, I am going to turn it over to Jessica to get us started.
Great, thank you, Melissa. So as Melissa said, I am the Member Engagement and Communications Specialist. And when Mike and I started talking about the Statement of Values and how we want to make sure that the HathiTrust member community is able to participate, this is where we came up with the webinars as well as the survey. And so today we're going to be spending a bit of time talking about the Statement of Values itself, where it came from, how it's evolving, and how you can participate in making sure that they are values that you as HathiTrust members can stand behind. So Mimi has generously agreed to be part of this conversation today. And as Melissa said, we will have time for questions at the end. We will probably take one question or so after Mimi and Mike have a chance to talk, but we'll see how we go on the timing. Next slide, please. So briefly, as mentioned, we want to make sure that we hear from as many members of our HathiTrust community as we can. So we've shared this quite broadly. Pretty much anybody who has been involved with HathiTrust in the past or currently, library staff, anyone who's served on our advisory boards has received an invitation to comment on the Statement of Values. So we're going to be continuing that spirit of engagement through the end of the whole period when the board will vote on a finalized version. But we're really taking in all the data that we can through the survey and these webinars to make sure that your voice is part of our evaluation and final product. Next slide, please. So this is, again, the kickoff period. We will be opening and having the survey open until the middle of March. We will be then also spending some time looking at the feedback, revising the statement according to some of that feedback. And we'll also share that feedback, again, with the membership community so you know what people had to say. There will be a vote by the member representatives of each HathiTrust institution, and that will follow, that actually comes after the Board of Governors review in early May. So we should wrap up the whole process by June. So this is a few steps along the way, but we really want to make sure that the members have a chance to weigh in on the Statement of Values. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike and Mimi.
Great, and I'll start off. Thanks, Jessica. I'm Mike Furlough, and just a quick disclaimer here. Ice has been sledding off my roof all day long. It makes a lot of racket, and there's like a 6-foot icicle right behind this window that's waiting to fall off. So if you hear a loud bang and I suddenly look alarmed, it's probably okay. It's probably just the ice. But with that out of the way, let me jump in now and start talking about what we're here today to hear about. I want to first ground this conversation about the Statement of Values with a look at HathiTrust's mission and vision. And Melissa, if you take a look at the next slide, what you'll see here is text taken from our bylaws and taken from our strategic directions. This is the work that we do, right? Everything that we do, our priorities, our programs, our services, all of it is intended to support this mission and work towards that vision. The focus is on preservation and access, and it's on to the collection we steward. And I think it should be clear if you look at these together that we are putting emphasis both on working with libraries in helping them accomplish traditional library functions around collection, preservation, and access, but also with the end goal of serving users, students, researchers, instructors, individuals who are out there attempting to learn or investigate some topic on their own. That's really what the collection is gathered for, and where we orient our work towards. Now, on the next slide, I wanted to start talking a little bit about how the statement of values sits alongside the mission and vision statements. The way I have been thinking about it is, describing them as a set of foundational principles that are intended to guide and shape how we do the work, how we execute the mission, how we work towards that vision. They should be guiding our work through our operations, our financial investments, our program and service development. They're not goals, right? They're not goals. They're not a plan, neither tactical nor strategic. What they are there to do is help us give us a reference point, give us directional reference for how we carry out our work. I would also say a word here about who is the we when we talk about the we and the values today. And I want to emphasize that, it will be a little bit fuzzy because there are times when we definitely emphasize us working together as a community. But when we talk about these values, the folks who are going to be most directly affected and guided by them will be people like myself, my team, the Board of Governors, perhaps you, if you're working on one of our governance groups or task forces. They're really about the institutional values of the organization and of HathiTrust. Now, I know that your library may have a value statement. If you don't, then your university or college or parent organization probably does. And those are often very much attuned to the institutional circumstances and the overall mission of the university. We don't expect that you're going to have a statement of values that matches ours exactly, or that ours would match yours exactly, but we do want them to be aligned, and that when you see these, you can say yes. And that's why we're here today, to kind of carry out this conversation and bring them to you and get your feedback. Now, the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about how we got here and why we're doing this. This is a new project for us to draft a statement of values and bring it to the membership. But I don't want you to think that this is necessarily a major turn in our work. It definitely is an inflection point. And from this point forward, you should expect us to be more thoughtful and discuss these more frequently. But we're not changing the mission, right? And as we develop the statement that we're sharing here today, we've tried to draw on our history, think about the past and what principles we have worked from before. But I also want to acknowledge that today it's important for us to think about drafting these, because as we have grown larger, some of the earlier ways in which we worked have changed. 8 or 9 years ago, we were an organization that was much smaller. Most of the libraries that were involved belonged to the Association of Research Libraries. You could assume a certain amount of familiarity and common shared assumptions among these members. But as you get larger to 100, 150, 175 members, you can't assume the same commonality in everything. You can't assume everyone is necessarily thinking the same thing in the same way. So we needed to be more intentional about this and to articulate a shared purpose and principles. We started talking about this in the Board of Governors about 2 years ago when we were thinking about developing a code of conduct. And the idea there was the code would help us reflect more on why we seek to engage with our members. But we thought actually what we need to do here is not just think about how we reflect on the engagement, but reflect on all of the assumptions, the purpose of our work. And so the board agreed we should develop a statement of values, and that led us to appoint a task force last year known as the Code of Conduct and Statement of Values Task Force. And on the next slide, you'll see the folks who have been a part of that work. They did heavy lifting starting last April, I think. We appointed the group in February, and then everything changed. And I just have to thank them for working through really challenging and difficult periods of time last year at their home institutions and in the world, because this was not easy work to do. Where we are with the work products that they've developed, the Code of Conduct, the team has definitely developed a Code of Conduct. The board has reviewed it, and the board has sought guidance from the University of Michigan on a few key issues. That code is thus under review by the University of Michigan. They're our parent institution, and I'm expecting that we should be able to bring it back out to the membership later this spring. For the values, the task force began work on this by reviewing all of many historical documents, publications, bylaws, strategic plans, and so forth, and extracted a number of values from them that they thought were operational, and posed a series of questions back to the the leadership of the organization about those particular values, asking us to reflect or respond to some of the ethical dimensions of these. If a value is access, then access for whom? How do we enable that? As an example. And those were really useful questions, thoughtful questions, and they led us to recognize that the leadership really needed to take more responsibility for articulating a statement of values, and trying to respond to some of these questions through that statement. So that's where we are today. And on the next slide, I'm going to transition to the discussion of these particular values. I just want to say at this point, the draft that you're going to see today was prepared primarily by leadership, me and Yolanda Cooper. It's been reviewed by the board. They looked at it last October and decided it is not finished. The wording might need to change. The values themselves might need adjustment. But we felt like it was important to bring it to the membership at this point so that we could get your feedback, so that we could see whether it was aligning with what you were expecting. And then commit to making changes in response to that feedback, and then bring it back to you and ask you to vote to ratify the values later this spring. So we're in the early part of this process. On the next slide, I have a very short bulleted list of the values. They are trust, access to knowledge and open inquiry, equity, diversity and inclusion, interdependence that builds resilience, constructive, meaningful engagement, and leadership that embodies both conviction and humility. These you will see if you go to that URL, and it might be helpful if we drop that into the chat window so you can click on that. If you go to that URL, you'll see the full list along with a complete statement of each one and a little bit of context there. I hope that will help you understand these. Plus, we're going to go through these one by one now. And I want to do that. I want to bring on Mimi Calter. Mimi, as you've heard, is a deputy university librarian at Stanford University. She's a member of our board of governors. And I just want to say first, Mimi, thank you for agreeing to do this today and joining us. And to get us started, I'd like to ask if you would maybe talk a little bit about your own interest in this work and this process beyond your role as a member of the board of governors.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and thanks really for including me in the discussion today. I'm really interested in this topic, in this discussion. You called out in your remarks that, well, I see the value statement as really an important marker for HathiTrust in terms of its development as an organization. You talked about the process that we went through to get here, and I'm really happy to see HathiTrust evolving in this way, this sort of community-focused way. And I really do see these conversations where we're bringing in the whole membership as core to the development of a value statement that's really integrated with the organization, and it really does represent the organization as a whole. As a board member, it is both valuable and important to me that the organization is thoughtful about what its values are, and that it has put in what is really significant effort to articulate those values clearly. So, it's been an interesting experience for me. I've been on the HathiTrust board and watching HathiTrust work through this process. I've also been leading a process, a similar process in my role at Stanford. And the Stanford libraries actually went through a multi-month, not quite a year process, and published its own values statement just this past fall, after working through a number of bringing in outside consultants, working through a number of group meetings. So I know how difficult it is to ensure that everyone is engaged and everyone understands they have a voice in developing these statements. But I also know the value of that process. The value of the process in building community is key, and it becomes something of a virtuous circle. The values, frequently the values that are being expressed are being reinforced through the process of engagement and interaction and discussion going on with the membership. So I'm just really happy that we're having this discussion today, and I'm glad to see such attendance as sort of evidence of that engagement and interest among our members.
Great. Well, thanks, Mimi. I really do appreciate your being here. And Melissa, I'd like to ask you to advance on so we can begin to take a look at these in turn. So the first one we'll talk about is trust. Trust we see as paramount. It's the basis of our preservation and stewardship mission, and that's one we undertake on behalf of our community. So we think, therefore, it's important, it's necessary, really, that everything we do build trust, right? That everything we do ensure that you can trust what we're doing, that our infrastructure is trustworthy, that our decisions are sound, and that we build that confidence through many different avenues, which might include, transparency, kind of this process such as this. We do try to make sure that we're always straight up and honest with folks in the fall about our annual budget, which has to be approved by the members before we can actually enact it. And I think for me, this has always been like the one thing I recognize that was critical and to our functioning. And the one thing that I would say is if we cannot maintain it, we're really at risk of failing in our mission. So, I think I want to ask Mimi, since you are not just a member of the board, but you really are, a representative from one of our member institutions, could you talk a little bit about what this means, for you at your library and maybe in relation to HathiTrust as well?
So I'm happy that this is the first value statement that we have up there. I do think it's important. I think you led into this as well. There's different levels to that answer. As I've worked through the process of building, as I followed through the process of building the value statement, I've really come to understand how many different levels of trust there are embedded in HathiTrust, in the HathiTrust name, with trust right there up front. Clearly it's important for a preservation organization to be trusted. We have to be a trusted repository. We have to know that the content and collection that we're storing is secure, that it's accessible, that it's there. But HathiTrust is so much more than just a platform or a vault that we trust to hold collections securely. There is much more to the organization than just preservation of content. There's a whole community built up around the content, and members are actively engaged with the community and with the content, and we know that engagement helps to ensure that the preservation mission is also being respected, right? Because if you've got that engagement, it's much more than just a sort of passive concern. So that trust is interactive. It's built between members, and members really are invested in the collection and invested in the organization. So I think what it means to me, what trust means to me, is that collaboration, that interdependence within our organization, and a willingness to work for the good of the group. Okay, so are we going to? Do we have time to take a question? How are we doing on time?
Good question. Jessica, do you feel like we can take time? We have time for a question?
I think we can pause right now and take a question before we launch into the other ones. A couple minutes.
If there are any.
If there are any,
there
type
are.
them into the chat or unmute yourself.
And if not, we can
Carry on.
can charge ahead.
Right.
Okay, so our next, there we go, next slide. Access to knowledge and to open inquiry. This is really key to what we do. HathiTrust exists to provide access to the information that it stores, and the HathiTrust vision statement that Mike showed you at the beginning of this session really does acknowledge this. And I'm going to quote here: HathiTrust will be a vital catalyst for emerging forms of research, teaching, and learning that engage the scholarly and cultural record. So that concept of engagement and access is really, really there. And we regularly talk about the core philosophy of HathiTrust being preservation with access. You have to acknowledge that there has historically been tension between those two, and there certainly can continue to be. But HathiTrust as an organization from its founding has really sought to pursue the broadest access possible. So having access, access and openness articulated in the value statement, I think is certainly from my perspective, very important. It reflects the mission of the members as they came together to work collaboratively in this community. And it also demonstrates that HathiTrust serves its users, but it also serves a broader community. And a great example of this is work to make public domain materials more accessible, making them accessible to readers worldwide, not just HathiTrust members. So Mike, I use that phrase, broadest possible access, and it is the broadest possible access. That it does imply that there are limits. So how do you, or maybe how should we be thinking about constraints on access in the context of our values?
Yeah, thank you, Mimi. And I think it's important here to acknowledge that, a piece of feedback we've received through the survey already has said, this is interesting because, you're not really open access, right? There are limits to what users can do with the content. And I guess I would like to reflect for a second that, first of all, it's important to know we can't do any of these perfectly, right? Organizations, I think of as, humans are imperfect, but also organizations are not necessarily always the ideal mechanisms to accomplish social good. They're what we have, but they work in particular environments that are, kind of constrained by law, by finance, by contract, by social relations, and so forth. That's very abstract. And let me make it more specific here. The collection that we steward is about 60% of it's under copyright. We do not have generally licenses with any of the rights holders or publishers to produce that work. Almost all of it was scanned under exceptions in copyright law, including fair use. We make it available where copyright is expired or under specific limitations under the Copyright Act in the United States and beyond. We kind of try to balance a range of interests of different stakeholders here. There are the rights holders themselves. There's also the users. There are the member libraries. There are the businesses that help build the mass digitization program that all have an interest in how this material is accessed, and sometimes will not fully align, right? That we might want more stuff available, but we find ourselves in some way unable to go beyond where we particularly are at that time. That said, one of the things that I think is important about this value is recognizing it's about trying to push beyond where we are. That if there are going to be constraints, look for the opportunities we have to try to break those up a little bit. So for example, we have been involved in advocating for copyright reform, visited the offices of the Register of Copyrights, talked with them about Section 108 and problems that it creates for HathiTrust and its members. And we're definitely not above reevaluating the balance of interests in these resources. So for example, last spring, as everything shut down in library land, we really decided we had to make more of the collection available under fair use for continuity of access to collections in our member libraries. And that's what led us to produce the Emergency Access Service. So I would say this is one thing that we're kind of keenly aware of at all times, being one that we're always going to be less perfect than we want to be, and continuing to try to work towards ways we can make the collection more accessible to more individuals and more users. So with that little halting ending statement there, let me just see if there's time for a quick comment. I'm conscious of time and wanting to get to group conversation at the end of this too.
Probably good to move on. We definitely have some time where we can address all the values and questions that are coming in.
Great. Well, let's go on to the next slide then. And this gives me a chance to introduce equity, diversity, and inclusion, which we are, recognize as something that promotes justice. It creates communities that are thriving. It helps advance collective knowledge. And here, I think it's apropos to talk about this in the context of access, that in the way as we just were. One of the things that has always been critical and important to HathiTrust and its members has been using the corpus to provide access to users who are blind or print disabled. There is a broad exception in the US Copyright Act that permits that to be done. The Marrakesh Treaty internationally permits that to be done. When the corpus was created in the last couple of decades, it represented a potential transformation in how users who are blind or print disabled could access the historical published record. Books has historically not been produced in mass ways for users who were print disabled or blind. Certainly they were, I would think of them much more as the exception rather than the rule. So we immediately started working on setting up programs and services like the Accessible Text Request Service that would enable us to provide direct access to the collection for users who are eligible and have a recognized need for the service. But this kind of goes beyond that. I mean, that's one thing that we've done well, but we kind of recognize that we have a lot more to do here as well. And last summer, we made an affirmation and a commitment to continue working towards an understanding of how different structural inequities, different structural power forces, how structural racism has shaped historical collecting practices in libraries, how it has shaped metadata practices, how it shapes how our organization has developed over time, and try to use that understanding then to begin to make changes that could address those and kind of break them down to the extent possible. The most obvious place this is somewhat in our control, or more directly in our control, let me put it that way, is in our own membership strategy and looking critically at who is in our membership, what communities have not historically been represented in our membership, and thinking about what can we do to reduce barriers that we may have put in their way, which requires an understanding of those barriers and more conversation and outreach to those communities. But you could also say the collection is likely very much overrepresenting certain kinds of topics, certain communities of authors. The metadata we know is something that is imperfect and historically has often, we've often seen examples of metadata that dehumanizes individuals. And we want to make sure that whatever we do in our collection, we can minimize or eliminate those. But there are really systematic issues here where I think we have to work with the entire community to try to advance some of that work. So it's a long time commitment we're making. It's not a one-year project by any means. And Mimi, I know that from talking with you, this past year, a lot of the libraries have had these moments where they recognize how little they have done, rather, how much more they have to do. And I wanted to ask you about how HathiTrust can support the steps that members are taking to address challenges of our history in their own locations.
So thanks, Mike. And I am really glad to have the chance to talk about this because I do think it's a really important topic and one that is top of mind, certainly for me, and I know for a lot of my colleague institutions. And I think the answer is that at some level, some of this conversation plays into it. It's really important that that HathiTrust's values be aligned with my organization's values, and that thus the programs that HathiTrust is developing around the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion are similarly aligned. At Stanford, we are putting a renewed emphasis on equity. We are not alone there, and we're doing things like reviewing metadata standards. We are taking steps we're looking at trying to at least identify some of the structural inequities that we know are baked into cataloging in particular, but into our collection and collection development systems. So we need Hathi to really support those changes, support us in making those changes, support us in thinking about how we approach these questions. And I really do think this is a place where HathiTrust has an opportunity to both enable and magnify the work that a lot of member institutions are beginning to do locally. So having HathiTrust as a place where we can come together and talk about talk about this work that we are all taking on is really going to be important. There is work happening at the community level. We know that there are some really large structural questions that sort of are pervasive through libraries, even through higher education, that we're going to need to be thinking about, and we're going to be able to make a lot more progress by thinking about these problems together than we will on our own. Okay. I'm checking the chat to see if it looks like anybody has questions, but maybe we should kind of move forward, and then we definitely have time for questions and conversation at the end.
Yep.
Okay, so our next value, interdependence builds resilience. Interdependence that builds resilience. This one I think is going to be an important one to talk about, because I think it does benefit from a little bit of discussion. The term interdependence, I mean, I've already used it a couple of times. It's a key part of that concept of community and of co-investment that is really core, I feel, core to HathiTrust. And the success that HathiTrust has had to date has really been about collaborative investment at scale and around taking advantage of opportunities. And so achieving scale really does require us to be interdependent and working collectively. So we see that in HathiTrust's work, for example, on shared print, where disparate collections are being more effectively managed through the commitments of multiple libraries. And there's really a lot for us to think about there. So Mike, I'm gonna throw this question out to you. What examples, having thrown that example out there, could you talk about what resilience and interdependence mean for HathiTrust in the outreach that you've done and in working with its members?
I would, I think that it's fair to say that interdependence was one of the key goals. It was one of the key motivating issues for the founding members 15 years ago or so. The libraries recognized that to develop common infrastructure would give them a better footing for making more progress, and would really put them in a position to start looking at how they would work together to manage collections more effectively and collectively. I would point to one example here, again from last spring. I'm going to probably bring this up a couple more times. The Emergency Access Service, I think, has been cited by several people as an example of what multiple years of investment in digital preservation can bring the community at a given critical moment. That at that moment we were able to support the ability of individuals to access library collections at a moment then when we didn't know if it was really safe for people to handle physical materials that have been circulating. And I think that contributed greatly to, honestly, to a lot of libraries being able to, fulfill their work at a time when their classes were still operating. I do want to acknowledge, though, that a comment we received through the survey, and one person pointed out, the interdependence doesn't necessarily build resilience in itself, right? It doesn't, there's conscious effort you have to put into this. You can have people reliant on each other without necessarily having that resilience in the system. And in fact, when libraries could not circulate books last spring, interlibrary loan kind of shut down nationally there. It was a kind of a challenging couple of months there. So I think what I would, emphasize here is what this user or this individual mentioned to us, which is that, many of us need to be investing in organizations that help us be more efficient, help us achieve more than we could independently, and offer sustainable solutions. That's a direct quote from a member, and I think it's important to keep in mind that that is what starts to look like resilience, and we need to be deliberate about that. I want to go on to the next slide and next value so we can keep moving here.
Yeah.
And this next one is on the topic of engagement. Constructive, meaningful engagement ensures that we benefit from our collective expertise, from our colleagues, our members, and our users. This one, I would say, links directly back to the work we have been doing to develop a code of conduct. It recognizes that we're very highly dependent on members to help guide us in our work. This is something that has been in the DNA of the organization, if you will, for a very long time. Even when University of Michigan and Indiana were saying we will take the lead in developing software and systems, there were working groups of librarians from other libraries who were making decisions about priorities, about feature priorities, about service priorities, decisions about how search would operate were being made with individuals from multiple institutions with a stake in the outcome of this. And I think this kind of impulse to consult, to hear from, to draw from, and to meet our users and understand what's important to them is something that I think we need to definitely continue on into the future. I like to think of ourselves as not just a member organization, but one that's definitely member aligned and member informed. And I think by doing so, I would want to think we're helping to develop and continue to build trust with all of you in doing this. Mimi, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this yourself. Clearly, engagement's important to any member organization. Do you think that it's, why do you think it's important, or do you think it's important to state this explicitly as a value for HathiTrust?
So yes, I do think it's important that it be stated explicitly as a value. And I know from some discussions that we have that it hasn't actually, HathiTrust hasn't articulated engagement as a value before, like the current strategic plan. So I really am glad to see this focus being raised as part of the discussion in our value statement. I see in my role on the board that HathiTrust leadership really is thinking hard about engagement and doing it in ways that some other membership organizations may not be. HathiTrust is an organization that works actively with and for its members, and therefore engagement is critical from that perspective. We want the organization to be strong, and we need that engagement between the members to be part of that. The engagement is critical to build those relationships, but HathiTrust also works actively with and for its users, and that's a broader community than just the membership. So the focus on access to collections across the whole user base gives a different spin to engagement than some other organizations might have. And I think that's an important thing for certainly for the leadership to be thinking about, and for folks who are engaged with the organization to be thinking about as well. Doing one more check to see if we have questions, but I do think it's good if we move on. I think we should probably move on to the last value that we're putting forward here, leadership that embodies both conviction and humility. And certainly this is one that is of interest to me as a current member of the leadership team. And it's talking about how HathiTrust is committing to practice leadership. We want how we lead to reflect our values. So it's kind of a meta value. We've got this commitment to practice our other values in a way that is setting the pace and demonstrating leadership through the larger academic sphere, through the larger library sphere. It's not just about how HathiTrust is led and how the leadership of HathiTrust behaves, but how HathiTrust as an organization intends to practice its leadership. And have that whole broader community beyond just its membership see that leadership. You've talked a couple of times about the emergency access, the emergency temporary access service. That's a great example of HathiTrust being out there and demonstrating leadership. It's something that a year or two ago we didn't even know it would be necessary, and then within 2 months it became something that was completely critical to HathiTrust members. And we certainly want to be able to, as opportunities or challenges, two sides of the same coin, as those come up, we really do want HathiTrust to be able to be in front of those questions and take a leadership position. So Mike, you are also in a leadership with position with HathiTrust. You report to the Board of Governors, but they've charged you with the responsibility of carrying out its work. So what does this statement mean to you?
So I guess I would say that I think both of these qualities, conviction and humility, they're really essential to leadership, no matter what field you work in, and whether you're talking about individual leadership or organizational leadership. And I won't go into my catalog, but I can think of many organizations that do not embody these two qualities, and you see the results
Yes.
on a regular basis. And I'm not necessarily talking about our field. So, I think conviction for me, it means working with the confidence that, that you're doing the right thing. You're working to face the challenges, the problems that are in front of you. You're not trying to avoid them. It also doesn't necessarily mean you act quickly, right? It means you act thoughtfully. It means you take the time to understand whether and how your choices will be the right ones. But it cannot slide into, necessarily certainty, right? You have to have an understanding that you're not always right, that you'll screw up, that it's going to be imperfect, and you need to be able to try to learn from that. And so, just to kind of compare back to emergency access, we had not done anything like that before. Earlier I said, we had to really rebalance how we thought about fair use in the particular moment. And as a result, we decided, we had no choice really, but to go ahead and work on, take a risk and open the collection to libraries that were suffering major disruption. It was, it felt like the right thing to do, and something we had to do. That said, we knew that we were kind of flying the airplane while we were making it at the same time in this, and we were not going to necessarily do it perfectly. And, in the months that followed, we had to really kind of swallow hard a couple of times and change some aspects of how we had done it, and recognize that that was something imperfect the way we rolled it out. We need to really back up and try to help our members through this a little bit differently. Can't do it on everything, but where we believe it would make a difference, where we think we can, we will try to do so. It still is not a perfect service, and I would never claim it is, nor is the rest of what we do perfect. But I do want to kind of conclude here by just, saying that I think that I said earlier, what this moment means is not a major change in our direction and our role. But I do want to make sure that you understand this is, a recommitment for all of us here to, live by these, to pay more attention to these, to think about these more critically and reflectively as we're doing our work as we go. I've said many times, the last thing I want these to be is something you put into a little frame and then it hangs on the office wall. I'm not even in my office now, so I would never even see it if we did that. But I think critically, it needs to be part of our ongoing practice. How that becomes so, I don't have all the answers yet, and I'm going to be looking both to my colleagues in the board and the Board of Governors, the membership, and to my colleagues on the team as well for more guidance on that. Now, with that, I know we're just about where we need to be. So let's stop and start taking some questions or have some discussion with all of you about these. Here are a set of several questions that we thought it might be useful or helpful for you to be thinking about. They're ones that we want to know more about. If you have other questions or other remarks, critiques, what have you, I definitely want to hear them now. This won't be your last opportunity, but it's one good one. So.
There is one that's come in from Maggie. A general question about the values as a whole. Aside from the last one that was described as a meta value, are the others listed in order of priority or ranked in any way, or are they all considered more or less equal in priority?
That's a really good question. And I know that the order of presentation, can lead to an assumption of ranking. Trust, we said at the very beginning, is paramount. It's kind of like, the number one. And I think that the way this is written, we end with leadership in part because it I don't know, as in a writerly way, it kind of puts a nice bow on the package. I would be hard pressed to say that any particular ranking would ever stand up every day of the week and every week of the year. I think that at a given moment, you might recognize that one or more of these is going to be more operable than others. They're theoretically certainly going to be all operable at the same time, but some of the work that we're going to have to do at various points will more directly need to reference or lean on one of these principles. And I would, want to not try to privilege any one of them over the other, but want to try to recognize that, I guess another thing I need to say is that there are going to be times when they're in tension with each other as well. And that's an uncomfortable place to be, but I think what we have to do is acknowledge that tension, work to minimize it, or where we can't, acknowledge it and own it and do our best to try to explain it and why it is. So I don't know if that helps respond to the question, but it's my first thought about that. So.
We do have another one. Yasmin asks, I'm most interested in hearing some preliminary thoughts about how you will bring these values into practice. What do you anticipate being the biggest challenge or the least challenging?
I have a thought on that. Mimi, do you want to take it or do you want me to go first? I'm happy to go.
Go ahead, and
Okay.
And I'll jump in afterwards. Yeah.
I'm going to speak personally for a second and say that I think the one that is going to be the biggest challenge for the organization is figuring out what it means to commit to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Figuring out what it means to, try to address structural inequities. What does it mean when you don't get where you want to be on the timescale you mean? What are the actions that you can take that are going to be the most effective? What are going to be the limitations? And I think for me, I think that's such a, just for my own position, my own history, I got where I am partly because of the way I look. And the advantages I had. I think it, as sensitive as I tried to be about that over time, I recognize that for me as a leader, I need to learn a lot. I need to kind of step back on that. And, as leaders, you think you know the answer. And so you want to try to sometimes go there, but I need to kind of practice that a little bit more. For me, I think that's my personal answer on that. How we will, are we going to have it more practically? Will we have a checklist of every decision we make? Probably not. Will we need to have some mechanism for which we regularly reflect on these? Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for you about that yet, Yasmin. So Mimi, did you want to add anything here?
I just wanted to say, while we do want to ensure that we are that we have put these values into practice and that we are checking ourselves against them, that for the most part, this isn't what we're looking to articulate values that we have felt are already embodied in the work that we do, in the some of the organizing documents of the organization. So at some level, this is really just articulating values that we have been trying to put into practice anyway. So it's more a matter of documenting that connection. The diversity, equity, and inclusion effort is one where I think we all feel pressure to really actively put that value into practice, even though I think we would still say it was something that we've all always valued, but actually implementing it and putting it into practice is certainly a challenge. And I think that is clearly the one where we're going to have the biggest challenges. I think to the talking about things, to the extent you're asking, sort of where is the biggest challenge and what's the easiest thing, that calling out trust, I think, is critically important for us, but we have always focused on trust. And sort of understanding what we say, what we mean when we say trust has been valuable as we build out this statement, but it's not something where we really need to change practices in order to take those steps.
Yeah, thanks. That was really, as I said in the message, that was a good question.
It was, yeah.
Anything else?
I'm going to go ahead and
Staring at the
stop
chat window.
sharing.
Okay, thanks.
Follow-up question from Yasmin, how would Hati want to be held accountable?
You want to be held accountable.
Great question.
Yeah, I was about to answer with a flip remark, but I won't do that. It's not the moment. How do we want to be held accountable? Well, I guess, there's one way, there's one critical way in which members can hold us accountable. Participation in contribution to involvement in HathiTrust is not compulsory for anybody. I think that one powerful message members can hold us powerful is by voting with their feet. I would hope that long before it ever got to that point, we would have a chance to kind of work it out and make sure we are taking steps to be to go in the direction that you would want us to. I guess accountability is, I don't know that I have a good answer for how I would want to be. I would want to know when we're not, right? I guess I would, when we're not living up to this, right? I would want everyone to feel like they can write to us or call us if that's what you choose to do, and say, look, this is not where I think you want to be, or you've made this commitment but you're not going there, or I would need to understand better what steps you're taking. I think that if that for me, that's important in my own work with the people I work with. I want them to feel comfortable, kind of calling me out, and I would hope that everyone would feel comfortable doing that with us. My experience has been that no one is shy, but I think that how we report on some of our initiatives probably does need some thought, because we have been in a habit of kind of throwing out everything all the time, and we probably need to be a little more thoughtful about how we go in depth on some issues more frequently. So, Mimi, do you have any thoughts on that?
I will say something similar. I think there are ways. We've only had very preliminary conversations about things that we would want to do to hold ourselves accountable, and certainly we've talked about, as we're looking at projects and looking at implementing new work plans, that we would hold them up against the values. I think there are a number of things that we want to do to make sure that we are being systematic about thinking about our values. But mostly in terms of how I want us to be held accountable, I just want us to be held accountable. And I will say, I mentioned earlier that at the Stanford Libraries, we worked on revising and articulating a value statement, put something out in the fall. And I've had several situations already where folks have reached out to me and talked about some activity going on in the organization, and they've specifically called out, look, I feel like this isn't in line with our value statement. And it's been really helpful to me for people to have that framework to respond and to talk about the challenges that they see. So, I want the value statement to be there so that people really can hold a mirror up to it, or hold us to those standards that we've put out.
All right, Jessica, is there, I know we still have a few more minutes. Is there time for one more question, or do you need to bring us to some last moments here?
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one.
Still waiting for that icicle to drop.
That's
We're all waiting.
Well, it looks like there are no more questions. So I can drop into the chat here also a link to the survey. So if you have some ideas, things that you want to share, even wordsmithing that you want to do, and you haven't had a chance to share that yet, you can do so by linking to the survey there and completing it. It's relatively short, but it definitely is going to give us a sense of kind of some of the qualitative measures and some of the more details that you're thinking about as you've heard from Mimi and Mike today, and as you're looking through the statement of values. So that comment period and survey is open until March 19th. We also encourage you to have these conversations, with your colleagues in your own library. As both Mimi and Mike reflected, there are a lot of these value statements floating around, and I
Yep.
think it's worthwhile to have the conversation about how HathiTrust fits into those or how it differs. There is one more webinar that we have scheduled, and that is, let's see, Melissa, I don't know if you want to pop that slide up again. It is March 17th. Robert Mcdonald from University of Colorado Boulder will be joining us for that conversation. And again, you can pass that on to other colleagues if they want to join and hear more. With that, I think that is the very end. So,
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
I just want to,
Great.
yeah, thanks, Jessica, for moderating this. And I just want to say thanks to everybody for taking time this afternoon to be a part of this and to listen to what we had to say. And, don't be shy. Thanks very much.
Right. Thanks, everybody.